This is a note that I'm appending to the front of all these recordings that I've already made, because it's yeah. So I guess I'll probably come out with sort of two sets of recordings. One which is sort of political, and one which is purely psychological. And the point of adding this prefix, which will be on the psychological one, is just to sort of apologize for the dislocated sort of nature of this recording, and also the horrible sort of preamble, I guess this included, that goes on to that, which sort of goes on and on and on, sort of ad nauseum, about correlating some similarity between trying to decode and essentially use things that are written in the book of Revelations to explain some aspects of my model, or to use as inspiration for understanding how cohesively things in my model function. And it's sort of the first thing that I go into is very dry and very boring and not very useful, and it's quite long. So it's almost probably worth it to skip when I'm talking about the four beasts around the throne of God, and talking about the wings of each of these beasts. It's sort of it's not really anyway. Maybe sort of when I release more facets of some of the models and things like that, it's still important to have a recording of this. I like to think that a lot of these things that I upload, the purpose of that is to sort of try to save the research that I have done, or to at least have some repository of record of my work, essentially. But anyway, so yeah, it's very hard to listen to. And then immediately after I talk about that, I talk about things that are more relevant when I'm talking about the five kings that have fallen, and the king that is, and the king that is yet to come, and the beast, which sort of move into a set of eight things, which are essentially the eight relays that connect the four sides of the mind. And that is much more sort of psychologically pertinent. And then what is more important than all of this stuff is that when I actually use that as the baseline, or the basic structure, to then start exploring what's going on in borderline and narcissism, because that gives me enough of a scaffolding to at least talk about some of those psychopathologies, which essentially are particularly interesting because they straddle the line between the so I'm probably going to, this is meant to be sort of an introductory sort of comment, but I am just going to sort of then give some, at this point for the listener it'll be slightly strange, but to give some sort of concluding remarks. Right near the end of these psychological things, I actually got quite tired near the end of the recording, and I just started sort of saying some other speculative variants of how to interpret some of these things, or at least what one of the correct, sort of an alternative interpretation of similar kinds of structures, and within a spectrum of variants of what is likely or possible. And I indulge in that kind of speculative thinking about some of these structures. And I did misspeak when I did that, because I think that the structure is dynamic because it has, let's say, a reflection within it. That the king that is and the beast gets reflected in the set of six kings, five of which that are fallen and one of which is yet to come. And although there might only be three variants of that, I didn't say that in when I was talking about this, but essentially that there might be only Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, that essentially the king that is yet to come might always be one of only 3 possible in the set of 6. So, where the 5 fallen kings fall and the one that is yet to come, the actual candidate of the king that is yet to come might only be in 1 in 3 variants, but anyway, or it might be 1 of 6 variants. But anyway, that I guess is also a speculative element that will require contrasting different manifestations of metagram. But anyway, the 5 kings that are fallen and the one that is yet to come is basically metagram circuitry. So that is essentially, that's why metagram circuitry only tracks 6 of those dynamics. And then metatype is the sort of holistic view looking at what I call the condonation, or the king that is and the beast, that is essentially the actual sort of ground zero, which is reflected in the relays of the metagram circuitry. And then the relays of the metagram circuitry then are also virtually compacted within the superego dominant function, and how the superego's dominant function is fragmented. And essentially the thing that makes borderline a particularly troublesome psychopathology is that you sort of that dominant function's fragmentation, which is usually stable in most common sort of ordinary manifestations of metagram, has an ability to kind of re-fragment itself, or to reformat itself quite radically. And so there is some kind of the king that is, or the question, and this might also pertain to narcissists, because I say quite stark things, that essentially that for example borderlines don't actually have a question. They don't, in some sense, they don't have a king that is, or they have a king that is fundamentally premised on being dictated and controlled from the superego side of the reflection, because essentially of the ability to reformulate or reformat the superego dominant function. And that is also a reflexive defensive mechanism of being able to unilaterally control the the sort of the relative power that the seeming question, because in some sense the question of the borderline is fundamentally merged into the environment, but they still want to have a privileged node of a kind of a unilateral soapbox that their sense of self can dictate from a prominent position, but then that prominent position also, as part of its defense mechanism, can sort of can chimerically reformulate itself. It can redress itself, and it can also substitute its components with anybody else in the system. So it can kind of shirk blame onto other people and abrogate privileges onto itself. It plays this kind of mix and match. Sort of like, if you can imagine Barbie dolls, and sort of picking the parts that you want and swapping them with other participants within the domain, which is this kind of collective. So in some sense, their superego takes charge of anyway, so I mean, there are two kind of aspects of this. There's the kind of the narcissistic aspect, which I do think as well is kind of like that where the question is seen to animate other people, whereas the narcissist at least has the good sense of trying to rope other people into that question through manipulation, whereas the borderline is also manipulative, but in some sense will use themselves as the kind of as the tuning fork to sort of compel other people to take on the yoke out of a kind of sympathy. So in some sense, the borderline is using a kind of automatic sympathy with the self, and in order to anyway, you know, I talk about this in recordings a lot. Anyway, I mean, this is too much content for me to try to compress and summarize and relay concisely. But anyway, so the point of me trying to give this introduction is just to also anyway, so I mean, the borderline and the narcissistic and the narcissist case is the most interesting because their kind of psychopathology is directly related into how, in let's say, in an ordinary person, the superego would be attached to its own metagram circuitry and be integrated with its own metagram circuitry. Borderlines, I think, are essentially integrated with their own metagram circuitry. Narcissists are not. Narcissists have, in their metagram, I think they have a kind of corroded, arrested development because they can't cycle through their metagram circuitry without the drama that they get encapsulated within. Because they have a kind of collective metagram, where borderlines, I think, are basically just simulating the narcissistic tragedy in order to control their environment as a collective metagram circuit, but they still have a distinction between a self and an environment which is leveraged and then thrown under the bus at different times in order to exercise control. And so there's something like, there's an control imperative which is being voiced in some sense from the superego side of the reflection that is capable of even using its own sense of self to this comes into it very clearly when I talk about also in the political when I talk about the political metaphor of borderline personality, the identity politics, that essentially identity dysregulation is essentially caused by what's it caused by? Is caused by a kind of inherent contradiction that is kind of like the cost, the sort of the unavoidable cost attached to the kind of coercion and control that is being exerted in the method of that control. And so I think that, generally speaking, the borderline has a kind of question which is capable of disguising itself or miraging itself into a puppet that is capable of sacrificing. So they don't have a... It's kind of like a shell game, you know, in terms of how corporations, you know, set up, you know, different entities, and, you know, how some entities own other entities that then own other entities, like sort of subsidiary, you know, like shell game in that sense. Borderlines are basically playing that same kind of game, and what I'm basically trying to say is that what's at the core of it is that they are like the lawyers who design that. They're not like the pansy, they're not like the naive shell game of, oh, we didn't know that we were just a subsidiary of this and we were being used, you know, that actually they are the lawyer that kind of designs the concealments. But anyway, but the problem is that usually the thing that you're addressing or the thing that you're talking to is essentially the lure or the puppets. that is just another sort of chameleonic sort of mirage and amalgamate there to supply the function of control. And that entity is even capable of being sort of reprocessed and torn apart and recapitulated as a new visage, as a new face, as a new persona. So yeah, anyway, so that's how I see sort of the nature of the borderline project, is that basically it is centered. It's some kind of question that identifies itself as being a tool and an instrument that is serving the power of the superego's parent function. And so because they have, let's say, a sense, a contract that is in some sense the formulation of their metagram circuitry, or the constitution that underpins the metagram circuitry, that is fundamentally there to just sort of extend the reach of the superego parent function into the metagram circuitry, it's capable of sort of dying and being reborn. It's sort of like a phoenix in terms of its metagram circuitry, and so it doesn't negotiate the fidelity of its own metagram circuitry, which is basically a way of saying that the identity of the false ego complex has no integrity. It has no function of mediating its own identity. So it just because essentially it unilaterally defines its own identity, and because it's not willing to care about the upkeep of agreements about its own identity with any other entity, it sort of is locked into this unilateral kind of autism or solipsism, where it is always self-defining its own identity, and because it doesn't care about the agreements or disagreements and the consistency of that, because it's any negotiation done with it is a waste of time. It's just it's a stepping stone towards just the overarching plan of consistent control, because essentially it's all just a means of extending the control from this question, which is identifying with the superego parent function. It can recast its own dominant function. It highly relativistically revises its own fragmentation of a superego dominant function. And basically, look, I mean, what I would call sort of my definition of Keegan stage 5 or whatever, or let's say self-actualization and full integration of the ego, is that you have to essentially unify the dominant function of the superego, and that would essentially fix the ego sin or the superego death, which is the same function, but that would essentially start positively defining what was before limitations and conditionality of an egregious sort, because it both portends the sin of the ego and the limited atrophy of the superego's foundation, so that the edifice of the superego to even operate was essentially a fractured contradiction, but a frozen one as well, that some kind of imposed sort of chaos on that particular cognitive function that corresponds to the superego's sin, which is also the ego's sin, which is also the superego's death. And so being able to define that as, let's say, a positive, free articulation of that cognitive function in conjunction with a unified dominant function in the superego is kind of like the root, the cleansed root of a new persona. But in some sense, the actual ongoing functioning of the borderline is to continually refragment or reformat the fragmentation of their dominant functions, their superego, dominant functions fragmentation, which is in some sense the exact action of, let's say, the lie at the beginning of the formulation of the false ego complex. It's kind of, usually for most people it happens once, and in some sense it is an ongoing activity, but it's happening in the superego, and it's usually covered over by one's conscious attention being placed in the metagram circuitry. So, most people are trying to remove their eyes from the content of the superego, because it's just it's a cold war. It's just aggravating to see it like that, and it is in some sense the mark of the self affliction, as it were. But essentially, the thing that distracts one from that is the actual metagram circuitry itself, which usually people get lost in, and then they're in the other side of the reflection of the fundamental defective nature of this whole structure. But at least they're one removed from the actual real. It's something like the difference between in the Matrix movies. Fighting inside the Matrix, Agent Smith, and that this is all a plugged-in Matrix and it's all a control system, is different from actually negotiating with the machines in the real world. Negotiating with the machines in the real world is a whole different set of real politics and actual morality that's on a different level from, let's say, combating the system of control. So there are thematic connections between the reflection, but in some sense the superego thing is really the real thing, and it's also where the real impetus for managing the trauma that essentially usually the question or the constitution for the metagram circuitry. So in some sense you're locked in your own coping mechanism with some kind of anyway. I don't want to talk too much about this, but in some sense the borderline is constantly at the point of initiating that kind of rubric and structure, and they are recasting it and they're redoing it. So they are reliving sort of the early moment in the it's sort of like, I don't know, sort of between the ages of probably 1.5 years old and 4 years old is, I think, the ages at which people's metagram constitution are basically kind of being set. Anyway, maybe that should be between 1.5 and sort of 7 years old. Anyway, or that might be just sort of varying degrees of actual definition of because it starts off being quite vague and broad, and then it sort of becomes more particularized as more subjects and associated matters are sort of digested by what is at the beginning quite a sort of a vague treatment within the structure of what is essentially the kind of the overarching meta-type, which is perhaps even set even earlier than that the actual meta-type structure is there perhaps even at conception, but how that content is sort of developed within that architecture, because essentially the metagram circuitry, the development of the metagram circuitry is certainly a willful, organic development and process of construction that is consciously directed. Anyway, so I mean, just to preserve some of the sorry, this is getting so, this is the wrong time to be talking about this, because this might have to, this is probably not even good to listen to until listening to the other stuff. But basically, what I'm just trying to describe then is that when I'm sort of misspeaking about the speculation around what borderline is, sort of what I should have said if I had more energy to talk about it at that point, is that basically what I'm saying is that the question, the king that is, in the borderline case, is something like a redirect. To a control center that weirdly is probably also, because I mean, this is complicated, but basically the superego parent function is also participates within the metagram circuitry. It's one of the nodes that connect into the declaration, and particularly I think that might be what anyway, but so in some sense the question is there to kind of empower the declaration, or to redirect and to revert control back to the declaration. And so you kind of have a kind of structural paradox, which is also what eventually gets borderlines to generate the kind of delusional or sort of overtly deranged psychosis that usually develops as they try to control sort of divergent resistance against their tactics of control. So it's sort of they end up sort of doubling down on. I mean, in some sense, I mean, I could characterize borderlines as just basically having one defect: is that they can't take responsibility for anything. They can't hold themselves accountable in terms of their identity. Their identity must always be pristine and preserved and pure. And so there's always, let's say, a kind of narrative witchcraft and a reframing of the narrative, and a sort of some kind of cherry-picked reality filter that is always conducive, that they can declare that their parent function in their superego can just kind of end up sort of decreeing as being the basis of a way to analyze. I mean, you can see this kind of childish propensity of them to sort of wish thinking in their reality testing. And I get into this when I talk about sort of the political stuff. This is just essentially an effect of their need for control and their need to preserve their unilateral control and over issues or over their environment, and essentially because they cannot negotiate their own identity with other people, because they have to have the unilateral because of their strict allergy to in some sense having any kind of basic consideration into other people's view of reality. They essentially they cannot allow other people to to have any disagreement with their own reality, and so in some sense it's not even a question. They translate that into that it's not even a question of disagreement. It becomes sort of this hyperbolic morality, sort of blackmail, or sort of hostage taking, or sort of gainsaying and sort of reality filter. So you have all these other sort of foils that come into I mean the double down dishonesty essentially. And in some sense, the only way that it can get away with that is by masquerading as a defensive project. The only way it can get away with this kind of reactive mentality is by saying that it is securing itself and defending itself because it's so vulnerable and because other things are so dangerous. And so it has to kind of play at that narrative construct, so it always has to kind of put things into those terms, into a defensive, reactionary, necessary defense mechanism. So there are always these long rational chains of how it's justified or how it is in the narrative. It's necessary because they have constructed the narrative that way, and they're not willing to give other space to other people's reality in that narrative because it's not safe. And so you can already see how this is a perfect reflection for the mentality of identity politics, which is in some sense encouraging people to be stuck in this project of essentially identity dysregulation, that essentially means that their personal individual relativism can always be insulated and justified and have the ideological sort of implements to deploy themselves and to extend themselves and to sort of destroy environmental cohesion and real consent and agreement, because some people are basically given no leeway and sorry, I was trying to think of another word, but are given no opportunity to actually express their personal decision making and free independent thought, that they can't be authentic, they can't authentically make decisions because they are from the wrong category of identity, and so they must just give sympathy to the right category of identity. So it's this this kind of vampirism. It's sort of all hinged on this kind of scapegoat parasitism against the scapegoat that will always fill in the gap. That essentially, because especially when that identity is treated in a way in which time itself is not even respected, because it's not as they're not even criticized. The identity is not criticized at a particular time and a particular place. It's always a mixture of time and place, and it's always this weird kind of amalgamate. You people, your group of people over time, you should have done this then, and that's how some other now time. It's sort of like, you should have anticipated the future and compensated for it in the past and had perfect knowledge and had, sort of all this. So it's this weird moral conflation and reductionism in order to keep the narrative stable. you have to treat things, you know, in this very strange cosmic amalgamate, you know, which is very narcissistic. I mean, that is a narcissistic mode of in some sense, the narcissist is more responsible about this, because when the narcissist perpetrates this on other people, they at least track the collectivization that is occurring. They track the communal anyway. I go into this distinction. I don't want to go into it now. Perhaps even repeating too much, but already. But I do see narcissists as more victims of this structure, because narcissists, I think, suffer particularly from the fact that they can't access their question, let's say, with an internal locus of control. They can only monitor their question through a kind of enacted drama that involves other people, that involves kind of social ties. So they can only connect with their metagram circuitry vicariously. And so their extraction of narcissistic supply is, in some sense, which is also they also have a strange then form of question, because in the same way that I said that, you know, so in the same way that I suggest that a borderline doesn't have a question, they just have a redirect to control from the parent function in the superego, and they kind of identify as the parent function in the superego to the extent to which that they redraft their own dominant function, the superego. The narcissist, on the other hand, has a question that is fixated on the state of the beast, which is the how the parent function in the superego leaves the ego's sin, and the imposition that it inflicts, the limitation that it inflicts on the superego's death. And because they're so fixated on the limitation caused by the superego, and they're sort of carrying the cost of that, and they gain a kind of superego insight, which is capable of eviscerating metagram circuitry, because they know the negative truth of the metagram circuitry, that it's all a lie, and that it's all hollow, and it can all be cut down from the perspective of the superego, because it's all just a kind of reflective, it's a confection that reflects the state of the superego. And so they arm themselves with those tools, and they are so well armed that they can't positively access their own metagram circuitry without being entracted into it vicariously through some kind of a community, which they have to kind of agitate and goad people into sacrificing their own metagram, so that they can feed their positive adherence into the narcissist's introjective paradigm, which is basically the kind of the collective psychological terrain from which they garner the narcissistic supply. Because they need other people to interact with their false self, which is their metagram avatar, which they can't identify with, because they identify with the beast, with the death of the superego is what they actually are most focused on, which means that they can also cut down the 5 fallen kings, because they don't care about the king that is yet to come. They don't positively anticipate the king that is yet to come. So they are not themselves entranced by their own metagram circuitry, but they are indirectly aware of it, and they are also indirectly able to criticize it. They can see the weakness, they can see the fallen nature of it, they can see the stupidity of it, but they can't see the cohesive thread of, let's say, the positive anticipation. So in some sense, and the positive anticipation of the king that is yet to come, the one element within the circuitry which might provide the solution, that might have some kind of hope of, in some senses, also a reflection of the hope of the unification of the dominant function and, let's say, some kind of resolution to the false ego complex. And so they are sort of stuck also in a kind of arrested development. And in some sense, they are stuck mirroring, this is not exactly the right way to say it, but they are in the motions of trying to emulate or simulate something like an ego with the leftovers of what they have with the five fallen kings, and sort of maneuvering them in some kind of arena of an introjective paradigm in which other people need to supply the positive motivation of anticipation of something. In some sense, to try to reveal the false self as being something worth being, or sort of there's probably much better ways of describing this. I'm getting tired now as well, but or I mean, I guess the general hope, and this is also then I mean, this is just me trying to derive what the quality of the actual narcissistic question is, because it's another sort of chameleonic one. But it's something like that somebody else should ensure that the false self will actually bring a resolution, that it's not just, so in some sense the narcissist knows something about the truth behind the curtain, and therefore they won't actually deign to entract themselves into the metagram side of the false ego complex, unless they actually know that there's going to be some kind of it's not just a they have some true insight, as it were, as to why they are trepidatious about inducting themselves into the metagram circuitry. So they are trying to have it modeled and mapped out to them through other people, essentially providing the constituents, or at least the constituent fuel for the work or the project of it. But essentially they don't believe that they should essentially it shouldn't be happening to them, is probably something like what the question is that if it has to happen, somebody else should have already done it, or something like that. So it's this some kind of escapism. I mean, again, it might be something on the theme of that. It might be something that's sort of, because some ideas abstractly very quickly are connected with their inverse. That maybe they believe that it should be happening to them, that they do deserve it, but they don't. But they sadistically, somebody else should that they have the power, that somebody else should take their place. So it could be on that theme as well. It's that they should be able to control for substitution. That you know, it could be something about the ability of controlling for a substitutive procedure for not having to face these internal choices. And I mean, I don't want to be nasty, but you know, there are. It's very interesting how different people seem to develop such broadly disparate and different personalities from perhaps even similar conditions of abuse. That, you know, is not to say that people's upbringing was not, you know, sort of unjustifiable and monstrous and all those sorts of things, but it is very interesting how, you know, I mean, what Stefan Molyneux has perhaps described as, you know, some children are just are more bulletproof than others, it seems. But I wonder if I mean, there might also be certain discrepancies in terms of metatype architecture, that in some metatype architecture, some layouts are just more prone to certain kinds of tarnishing, as it were. But a lot of this stuff is very before metagram. You know, it's sort of the bridge between metatype and metagram. What I'm trying to gesture at is that a lot of this stuff is very abstract, is very philosophical. And it's so abstract that I think it is even somewhat dislocated or disconnected from issues of potentially abuse and things like that, because they're almost, these are on the order of sort of first principles or almost of so I mean, it could be that if you, let's just say that you see evil things happening in your environment, that then you associate, well, if human beings can be so evil and I'm a human being, then am I not also this prone to being this sadistic or being this malevolent or something like that? But I still think that kind of decision of that kind of perception, that kind of judgment, is a form of is very clearly a form of self-abuse, and you know, trying to sort of excuse that as to your environment or sort of teaching you that, I don't think it's possible to be taught these things. I think any kind of conditioning is really just a especially when you're dealing with these things that are so abstract and philosophical, that you could really take anything and go the other way. You know, you could just as easily say, well, this is evil, and lean towards well, I see that I have a choice as to what I do and what I judge, and I could independently contend an alternative course of action or activity or choice. I have that power, and they have that power, and therefore you focus in on the nature of that power itself and the importance of it or the significance of it. And so any kind of, let's say, opportunity of devastation is also doubly so a source of profound enlightenment. I mean, again, I don't want to point these out because these are somewhat sort of unfair. You see, perhaps I shouldn't. Perhaps now I'm being inconsistent. I should be more consistent and just say, no, I am blaming people for their own mentality. I am blaming people for their own personality. But I mean, obviously, one philosophical misstep early on can obviously have an incredibly huge influence over one's general trajectory in the development of their false ego complex. And that can be very hard under the weight of a habituated sort of trajectory. It's very hard without, let's say, the methodologies and the processes or the certain, let's say, key awarenesses that allow you to re-administer your own sort of decision tree in your own characterological constitution. Obviously, a lot of these things are much easier if there were sort of available models that people could, let's say, self-examine with tools that are make it easier for them to track their own disposition and the structure of that disposition. Anyway, it's interesting. It always just makes me think. It says, and the people of the world will ask, and whose names were written in the book of life before creation, something like that. Does it say Earth? Anyway, it's not that important. Okay, I would do wish I was more concise and clear about what I against the subject matter or about all the subject matter. But anyway, I think I've at least extolled the gist of what I wanted to say. Although what I've just gone over is going to be misplaced, put right at the beginning of the recording that I'm going to attach it to. But anyway, so I guess I apologize for that disjunction. Ooh, this is an addendum to my introduction, which is problematic because the introduction now is becoming the same size and of the actual subject matter that I was talking about, and I've really put the cart before the horse because I'm making this postscript, and so I've already made the content, and now I'm putting the summary before the actual content. Anyway, I don't envy the listener that has to sort of piece together all of this, but anyway, I just want to correct myself or elaborate what I was just saying, because again, the gist of what I was saying was roughly correct, but what I was saying in precisely was probably a misspeaking. So again, when I was talking about the narcissism thing and about going off and off about substitution, that in some sense the communal false ego complex metagram circuitry that the narcissist is engaging in does seem to have a kind of question that, which is basically supporting something like the components of things like the introjective paradigm and the false self, which are essentially, which will, I think, have the issue of substitution sort of baked into that on the ground floor in terms of the constitution of the actual question that a narcissist has. But in some sense, to talk about the narcissist having a question, because they have, it's essentially, it's outsourced onto the environment, it's collectively being emulated, and that they are as a kind of covert agent trying to create that introjective paradigm that terrain, that communal metagram circuitry, that sort of collective psyche that is connected with a superego, which is predominantly focused on the death of the superego, which is also the sin of the ego, and because that is so focal in terms of what has informed the actual constitution of the question, in some sense, I think the narcissist is more aware of the superego than they are aware of the metagram circuitry, which is why they can't keep their story straight, why there's so much confabulation in terms of the metagram circuitry, also because it's being shared by a collective, by a communal psychology in some sense, by an introjective paradigm that is the field of narcissistic supply, or the terrain from which narcissistic supply can be derived. So anyway, so it really, so when I say that, it's all about substitution, that is actually probably incorrect. That well, taking from the metagram side, it is about substitution, and that's probably very close to the structure of how the false self comes to be it comes into being and into formation. But from the actual authentic focus, with the super ego focus, which is on the other side of that is being reflected by the metagram circuitry as being a thing about substitution, on the superego side of it, it's about the problem of endorsement, is that the death of the superego cannot endorse the authenticity of the question, and so only wants to engage in the question if it, in some sense, if the integrity or the fuel, or let's say the epistemological charge is burdened by the environment. So anyway, so when I was going on and on about substitution, it's not incorrect, the things that I said, but it has to be contextualized into the problematic that these things are, the one is the reflection of the other. And the narcissist, I think, will generally be somewhat more stable, because they will also, everyone has a fragmented dominant function in their superego, and the narcissist will, in some sense, be in direct control of the tailoring of that fracturing of that. So it's not as if, in some sense, everyone's fractured or fragmented dominant function in their superego is usually developing, or usually changing over some span of time. It's evolving in some sense. And it is true that the narcissist's evolution is probably, capable of generally having some sense more simplistic and also more radical reorientations, because they're so few, because they're less entrenched in, let's say, the fidelity of their metagram circuitry, because it's being embodied by environmental participants. It's sort of being held in the collective, in the introjective paradigm. Anyway, I don't want to get too much into this, but so let me just try to finish that point. Why am I saying that? So but in some sense, the narcissist, I think, prides themselves in the solidity or the concretization of their style of participation, which is, sort of meant to be somewhat masterful or godlike, or at least capable of absorbing or being the recipient of narcissistic supply, which is at least in some part, in some form, takes on the character of some form of adulation or surrender. That it is kind of quite controlling, but it's sort of, I think the control is more a reflection of the concrete solidity of the position, which is essentially established. Because you see, the death is itself atrophied, so the death is itself cumbersome and slow and not able, and so it's sort of, although it might be exact in its in the impressions and the conditioning that is the source of the rigidity of a narcissist, or at least their robotic nature. The robotic nature of the narcissist is all imported from the nature of the superego death or the ego sin, and its particular sort of black and white thinking that will correspond to the particular cognitive function that corresponds to the superego death or whatever. That is what is going to be the engine of, let's say, both the slightly nebulous and radical development or let's say dispersal or reorganization every now and again of the dominant function, because their dominant function doesn't really have a fidelity in its fragmented, or the only fidelity is rooted in the character of the death or the ego sin or the superego's death. So it's a much more simplistic, because they don't care about the actual component, the branched issues that how the dominant function is fractured. They don't actually care to track that. They don't monitor that. They only monitor anyway. And in some sense, they substitute having to monitor that for essentially playing out essentially the central node upon which, that it all centers around the issue that is within the death, because that is the fixture that the whole game is played on. So in some sense, it's like someone who doesn't know how to play the game, because all they can do is in a rote fashion parrot off the rules and repeat the rules, but they don't even understand the application of the rules in any sophisticated form, because they're so obsessed and fixated in the letter of the rules themselves. So so that they can't see the wood from the trees, as it were. But anyway, what's my point? I wanted to go on to make sort of other further comments and points, but this is just kind of wild speculation and sort of loose philosophizing, which might also be a little bit dangerous, perhaps, to try to turn this into a bit of a narrative. But it is. I would just say it's interesting that both narcissism and borderline personality disorder, to me, seem to be like breadcrumbs that sort of are the obtuse, the other side of witnessing what's going on in the superego. And so it's interesting as well that I still think that there is something about the feminine stereotype which is more associated with borderline, and there's something about the narcissistic stereotype that is more associated with the masculine. And I do think that is interesting in itself, that because borderlines are especially, in some sense, modeling the activity that is performed at some point in the psychology of an infant or a new human modeling the formation of a false ego complex. And so anyway, I just thought that was an interesting insight, that that borderlines are seemingly exemplifying the process of concocting the game that is the game of the false ego complex, of being incepted into your own reality tunnel. And that might be a kind of something that many women have as perhaps a preserve within culture, perhaps even as a kind of as perhaps even a subconscious climbing rope that they provide to their own children in some sense, or at least that they can model in some small way, in some I mean, in some sense, you know, there is a borderline capacity within anyone's psychology in some sense, because it is the mechanism that developed your false ego complex at some point. It's just, you know, what borderlines are doing is they are sort of going through the gestation or the formation process of that and, you know, sort of as a, you know, they're almost portraying a whole life cycle. As a phoenix, you would see burn to the ashes and then be reborn from the ashes. That's what borderline is somewhat doing. And I would say that there seems to be, at least in my view, a great feminine trope, which might also be what fuels. I mean, I'm not talking about the political sort of almost like grievance. I wish that there was a word that meant race baiting that was generic, because, you know, the feminist traps, in terms of, you know, how they try to goad people into sort of representing to them social constructs so that they can complain about them or something like that, so that they can have an excuse to sort of trigger the exhibition and deployment of their reactive mentality. I think that there is that basic mechanism, which is something like the borderline reality inception or narrative spinning, which is part of almost the feminine repertoire. It's part of, and it's interesting because I do think that might be a kind of a natural cultural and psychological vestige that allows for, because, you know, like we don't live in a human society, we don't live in a human culture, we live we also don't live in a culture with families. The family is not an important social unit. It's actually it's gendered. We don't live in a society. We live in a society of men and women and mothers and fathers. That's what makes the family up, and girls and boys. You know, gender is, in some sense, a more prime psychological category than just these collections and units. you know, and you can, you know, sort of dig into that with sort of the metaphor of sex. I mean, I've used it many times in, but anyway, I mean, all reactive mentalities require something to be generalized or reduced or conflated down into an issue of control, generally speaking, to make it, to have a kind of a source of giving you allowing for the leeway to essentially displace values or discerning or sort of authentic judgment with just a kind of generic issue of control. That you don't have to be intelligent about thinking about something. If you can just reduce it to, well, it can be controlled for, if you just, you know, sort of obtusely manhandle it, essentially, or you just sort of obtusely have power over it. So you don't have to understand it, you don't have to ask questions, and it just becomes part of this generic coping strategy. And then that generic coping strategy becomes a kind of a hook for anything can then associate to it. Anything can be hooked into its plan and schema, and so you can just kind of keep on relying on it, and it just keeps. It's like a crutch that keeps on displacing. You know, and you know, sort of with a combination of avoidance and some kind of associative hook, you can essentially get away with just sort of controlling for all the things that you would otherwise find or have a history or some experience of having some kind of trauma with, or anyway, and there is essentially some kind of basic trauma, which is the, let's say, the cradled damage and hurt, which is you know, a kind of an issue which has been used to create a defensive armor. And you know, so and these, you know, and some armor is more agile than others. Some armor is more capable of being self-aware. You know, it is capable of sort of tracking what's going on underneath the armor because it has more facets of articulation. It has more functionality. And so, you know, it ends up becoming translucent. It ends up becoming part of the process of healing, perhaps. And that would be something like a more functional false ego complex that is part of, let's say, because in some sense you can't just take it off. You have to actually sort of, it has to become like a cocoon that then sort of provides the support so that a new creature can be reborn within it, like a chrysalis. So I would just say that anyway, yeah, the way out is the way through. Yeah, so I do think that you would have to sort of get the metagram circuitry into a well enough functioning state so that you could actually see the metatype structure, or I mean, or at least get the metagram circuitry into such a state that you could focus on the metatype. superego sort of. Anyway, what's my point? So I guess I guess I was just generally saying that narcissism and borderline are. I do think that even narcissism is almost a natural phase of development, which is usually graduated from. Um, it's let's say the pre-transition before grounding or anchoring one's sense of self in the metagram circuitry as opposed to the superego, that you do have to kind of actually break out of the superego usually and grow up in your metagram circuitry before you revisit the superego, or at least perhaps that's not necessarily the case, but I think that it might be necessary to have some requisite familiarity with the relays of the metagram circuitry, just so that one can authentically grapple with the metatype, the holistic metatype situation, because otherwise it won't be personally evaluated and believed in some sense, and you won't have the confidence to sort of operate upon the whole thing. Anyway, I'm just kind of babbling a bit, but so I was going to say that. Yeah, let me just finish this point about narcissism. So I think that the narcissist, the false self, is an empty avatar, which is being substituted for by the importation of an introjective paradigm and having a collective metagram circuitry. And I say this somewhat speculatively because I would hazard that narcissists will probably be all concentrated within either just a few or perhaps just one metatype, and then that particular metatype, the question or the inferior function of the ego will sort of hold the key as to explaining why they can only sort of support an empty avatar as the false self within their metagram circuitry, which would also be related to the actual content of the question as some kind of chameleonic sort of question that refers directly back to the death of the superego, or the lamenting and sort of creating a nexus of reticence into endorsing a, let's say, a solid identity that the metagram circuitry pertains to as a constellated self, with some distinction between it's interesting because I think that the real problem is that the beast has to be I'm not sure what to say. It's something about the beast has to be occluded somehow. It's because in some sense the beast is the the remark of the just if is the actual is a particular idea as what the just, which in some sense supplements for the need of a metagram circuitry or a false ego complex, or at least the metagram circuitry reflection of the false ego complex, because in some sense the death of the superego is the resolution of the whole thing. It is like it would be the thing that resolves the whole thing, but it can't be embodied. It can only be embodied as a collective, as it were. And so the beast has to sort of be, it has to be covered up somehow. It has to sort of be distanced and displaced from the actual, because it is the sort of, so like in the Wizard of Oz is behind the curtain, and it's, and he's not a wizard, he's just a man behind the curtain. But then there's also machines behind the curtain that are creating all the illusions that he is a wizard. And so on either side of the curtain, those machines are still ugly. The machines are ugly to the person operating them, to the so-called wizard, who's just a man behind the curtain, has to operate these machines. And when the curtain is drawn back, the machines are revealed, and they're ugly on both sides of the curtain. And that's kind of what the beast is, I would say. And the thing is that at least on the other side of the curtain, there's a curtain obscuring your view of the machine. And that is what the narcissist is lacking. The narcissist does not have a curtain. And so they need somebody else to provide the curtain in order to make the false self believable, so that they could endorse that avatar of themselves. But they can't, because they see the machines behind the curtain. And the machines behind the curtain are, let's say, the most marvelous source of, sort of, see, it's not, the metaphor doesn't hold exactly true. It's very close, but it doesn't hold exactly true, because it's not actually the machines itself. It's the effect that the machines, the control, as if the illusion were true, that the machines have the capability of fooling people and making them actually, they actually have the ability to, let's say, provide what they advertise, to actually deliver what is advertised about them. The problem is that this whole project is a form of, it's, in some sense, it's the substitution of real connection and authenticity with manipulation or power, power over perception or reality, or the appearance of reality. So there's something sort of intrinsically connected with the curtain itself and the machines, that together they come together to form a hypothetically absolute countervailing force of acceptance. It's sort of the prima materia, or the fabric that can generate any experience. And I think that is basically what the beast is, in the death of the superego and the sin of the ego, and which amount to the same thing, which happen on the same cognitive function. And so what is happening here, I think, is the narcissist can't turn down that that is the engine of the metagram circuitry, or that is the actual driving force behind the scenes. It is all made out of that sort of holographic potential or reservoir of illusion. And so instead of sort of going with the experience and indulging into the metagram circuitry, they won't do it, because then they let go of the levers over the curtain and the machine. And so they won't let it be done to themselves or something like that. Or if it will, then they will only incept themselves into the illusion if they can already be given some prominent equivalent, some equivalent of the power that having the hand over the lever of illusion provides. And so I do think that their question that leads to the sort of the behavior around things like the formation of a false self and sort of having a communal psychology of a metagram circuitry is that they want they're not willing to endorse their placement within the false self, because they are so conscious of the substitution, and so inside the false ego complex. But so inside the superego death, which I go on to explain as well, that I think it's made a particular alloy between the death and the child function in the superego, that they are actually using a child function in the superego, which is very problematic for their dominant function. It means that they can't actually formulate a superego dominant function, or just it's such a dysfunctional dominant function that has the properties of the ways in which that narcissists confabulate and such. Anyway, these are interesting points, I guess, and I've kind of talked around it enough. But I did want to talk about culture and society slightly. That it's interesting. Oh yes, this is what I wanted to talk about. And sorry, this is crazy to start talking about like a random sort of point here, but I've wanted to talk about this for a while. In the 1950s, culture was very different, which is why the 60s were such a rebellion against it. And I understand why there would be a rebellion against the culture of the 1950s, because the culture of the 1950s was, seemingly so robotic and almost dehumanizing with their rules-based system. Children should be seen and not heard, and just, sort of all these aphorisms of sort of concrete expectations. And I think that this is very much to do with the cycle. People talk about the fourth turning and things like that. And so I want to give my comment as to what these things actually are, and also what was going on in the 1950s. Now, I would be a contrarian to the culture of the 1950s. I probably would have also involved myself in the cultural revolution of the 1960s in some way. I probably, I don't know, probably in a different sort of way to the general counterculture, but at least I hope. But I do want to talk about the cultural value that the 1950s had for the health, the psychological health of people in general. Now, I know that, that itself is perhaps a controversial thing to say, but, especially when it comes to the sexual mores that were promulgated in the rules-based system of the 1950s, and how sort of repressive it was. But I'll just say that for more than one generation, I believe what went on in the 1950s in setting certain expectations into strict social conventions that perhaps were not followed by everyone, but at least they were known by everyone. So there was some kind of standard of ordinary that was generally regarded within a shared experience. So there was at least some benchmark of morality, so that people knew that they were, so even the people who broke the rules saw themselves as, I'm just trying to think of a pleasant word, I don't want to say deviant, but sort of they saw themselves as rule breakers, as nonconformists, but radicals in some sense. Let me just try to get to what I'm trying to get at. Now, I would hate having to follow rules that I can't find a substantiation for, a good substantiation for. I would like my rules that I have to follow to be justified well, so that the exceptions perhaps can also be known and things like that. But what these kinds of rules did, especially if you look at the rules of propriety and etiquette in terms of not expressing one's emotionality and reining in one's anger and, sort of thinking before acting and all these sorts of things. A lot of, in some sense, sort of bootstrapping basic liberal ideas, bootstrapping classical liberal sentiments of morality, in terms of counseling people towards keeping their own counsel and sort of being considerate in how they, are thoughtful in how they consider their options and things like that. Anyway, but doing so also with a recourse to very clear expectations that are set as being ordinary or normal, and all those sorts of things which, sort of which inspired so much rebellion, that what people, I think, don't realize is how safe that made culture against borderline individuals. Because now this, this is a fundamental sort of problem, but essentially the way to stop people using control and social manipulation with their own relativistic reality tunnels is to essentially have an orthodoxy which can't be bent, and which people have been schooled as to how people would subvert that structure, that cohesive bank of social conventions. And so what I see being promulgated in the 1950s, from all these sorts of morally instructive videos and things like that, is in some sense a kind of psychological defense against borderline individuals, essentially. It's almost like a kind of psychological immune system for a culture. I would call it overkill, perhaps, and not nuanced enough. I would feel very restrained living around people that have been sort of robotically programmed by rules that they don't understand, but which they sort of have blindly been indoctrinated with. And that was, in some sense, the seed of the rebellion against, that kind of rule-based order. But what the rules largely provided for culture was essentially some kind of rudimentary guard against relativism. Okay, I don't know if I can say anything more intelligent about this topic, but it's a substandard solution to a perennial cultural problem. If a culture can become susceptible to being derided and disintegrated by a kind of, I mean, now we have quite a concerted demoralization that comes from sort of identity politics, and that drives people literally toward a borderline sort of identity dysregulation, and an ideology that promotes identity dysregulation as sort of fodder for a more exacerbated, sort of push towards this brave new world, where it's interesting that, even mothers, it's literally straight from Brave New World. You couldn't say in regular society in Brave New World, you couldn't utter the word mother. It was like a swear word. And we are, I mean, it's sort of, it's you have to wonder if there's some kind of humor behind the fractious nature of the kind of the general disintegration of society as it currently is being perpetrated. But anyway, but it's interesting. But what is perhaps this is a point that I get into a lot when I talk about the political side of things. But that the reactive mentality, at least in the ideological form, which is in some sense more narcissistic than it is borderline, although it has elements of both, because the identity itself is pretty much borderline, but the actual adherent and follower of the identity politics is more in a kind of narcissistic valence, that they can only extract narcissistic supply from people who are channeling the perpetrator identity, or are, let's say, uttering the problematic views that contradict and that imperil the sociological planning, and who are deploying the kind of the ideologically incriminated, social constructs that are problematic and that are harmful. And so when people are bringing up these offensive social constructs, ironically, that is necessary for the ideology to spread. It is the fuel, it is the narcissistic supply, because that is the opportunity to experience the different semantic structure and the alternative sociological planning that needs to sort of displace the problematic utterance or the problematic view, because in some sense it's all about the psychological colonization of those who would offer resistance. In the same way that a narcissist needs to impel people into their collective psychological circuitry, or their community circuitry, they have to redirect. It's all about redirection, and without the redirect, there is no source of narcissistic supply that comes externally, that comes from others, from the environment, that is the substitute of your own endorsement. Because in some sense it can't be endorsed because it's so paradoxical. It's so sort of fundamentally sort of self refuting in some sense, that it doesn't even lead to rationale. It doesn't, in some sense, without the conflict that it generates, you don't even get a sense of activity in some sense, without redirecting people into the plan, into the collective homogenization or acceptance of the facade, or of the pretense. So sort of being able to regulate other people's acceptance of the pretense is the sort of is the juice of the whole enterprise, and in some sense everything else is just a kind of prop, is just an excuse in order to facilitate that kind of sadistically edged reality vampirism, or sort of parasitism on redirecting other people's free choice and sense of reality, and sort of being able to use that as the material to mold your own imaginary counterfactual alternative to what it would be if you didn't get involved in it. And ironically, that's the argument that they have against the perpetrator identity and the scapegoat, is that the scapegoat already redirected you, and you're just trying to get your own back. You're just trying to sort of reach some sort of reset point by putting the same screws on in reverse onto the other person. So it's, it's sort of trying to fight fire with fire, is its reactive mentality form of logical substantiation of itself. And I do generally consider, the Jungian aphorism, what you resist persists, I think is roughly true. And so it is actually better to sidestep them by saying that you don't support social constructs. You just believe the things that you believe, and if those things happen to support certain social constructs, and because most people seem to have similar ideas, so be it. Like, social constructs will be a natural reflection of some kind of demographic endorsement of certain concepts, and trying to sort of ideologically hijack the lexicon and definitions of words in order to try to, anyway, I go into this in the political stuff. I'm repeating too much of it already, but anyway, yeah, I've now gone on, and anyways, this is going to be horrible repeats all over the place. Let me stop this recording already, but I've provided perhaps a more clear substantiation as to why the current issue is more narcissism than it is borderline, although it does require an understanding of borderline, because the identity itself, at least conceptually, is a borderline, operates as borderlines operate, but people are not identities, but they have to relate to them conceptually, so they are relating to a borderline in their head, which makes me wonder also if the cause of narcissism is not perhaps in natural narcissists, is not perhaps exposure to borderline cycles of lability that has resulted in a kind of natural reticence to, in some sense, it's schooled the borderline, it's schooled the narcissist into the nature of the false ego complex and the falsity of it, in some sense, the instability of metagram circuitry, so much so that is what they have a direct reticence about, because they know that essentially it's just a matter of time before the borderline pushes the reset button, and new reality tunnel displaces the old reality tunnel, and so they have a natural reticence from their experience that the false ego complex is a false construct, and therefore they can't inflate their own without the help of some kind of community or other people. And they've sort of imprinted that in their model of how they are. Because, I mean, just because you do that, I think that doesn't stop you from having metagram circuitry. It just means that you end up with a very mangled form of metagram circuitry that is being hobbled by some particular constitution of it. As I haven't perhaps explicitly said this, but I think that's what I've been trying to explain, is how people that ostensibly don't have a question, or they have a communal question that is being shared with their environment, still have a question that allows it to be dispersed over their environment. But it's obviously it's very precariously formulated, obviously, and I've speculated as to and plumbed the depths as to its kind of fragmentation itself, and essentially how it has to be more understood from the super-ego side than from the ego side, and from the metagram circuitry side. Anyway, a lot of this might be a bit too much up in the air as well. I need to give good graphics as to what these structures, as to the holistic structure looks like, so that you can see the reflection on both sides and things like that. But anyway. This is embarrassingly yet another addendum, but I feel remiss if I don't sort of make this point, even though I think in the 2 hour sort of political stuff, I do sort of arrive at this conclusion, but I just feel it's worth pointing out. So the thing about the 1950s that I find problematic is that it's essentially a form of cultural imperialism where you can use that as a defense against the imperialism of a borderline. So you stop the borderline from being able to socially manipulate and control with their reality tunnel, is because you have an orthodox baseline reality to use as a defense against their reactive mentality, sort of defensive passive aggressiveness. Anyway, the problem is that then you become captive to that form of imperialism, which is which I mean perhaps is not necessary. I mean, if you can round out everything into a generalization which is on the whole roughly sort of supporting and rational and reasonable, and is sort of the kernel of a reasonable and functioning structure of culture and society, that it's not necessarily a problem. But anyway, it works as a very useful defense against borderlines, which is probably something of a cultural necessity, because if you're not able to resist kind of the decompartmentalization and demoralization of having people set up their own reality tunnels based on nothing but relativism, then you're going to have a very poor time very quickly. Things are going to disintegrate. Let me just talk about narcissism again as well. So it's interesting that I kind of speculatively state that there is something about the feminine trope which has something to do with borderline inculcated within it. And even I always point this out, that female borderlines and male borderlines have a different kind of experience, I would say, within culture. They have a different presentation in how their psychopathology manifests. Because of the permissive sort of latitude which is given to women in sort of exploring the borderline behavior and let's say realm of sort of counterfactual deployment and things like that. there is something sort of more quintessentially feminine about it, also because somebody else has to sort of provide the sort of the rationalizations and the stability that sort of dignify the sympathy extraction. That it sort of it fits into the stereotypical gender roles, which is also something, or anyway, that's one of the contradictions within sort of feminism. But anyway, but it's interesting that essentially borderline is perhaps a natural, cultural, psychological mechanism that is installed within the gender divide, because as I was trying to make the argument, culture and society is not made up of generic components, it's made up of gendered components. And psychology has had to use those components as the structure of even reproducing itself. But more psychology than culture, which is sort of the actual thing that's carrying culture within it as well, perhaps. The psychology is by far sort of is that is a necessary function. But anyway, so borderlines are perhaps exists to perhaps varying degrees of propensity in order to model to the young, or sort of suggest to the young, to give some sort of imprint as to how the game of developing a false ego complex is occurs, and that perhaps narcissists are people who see that this game is so fundamentally pernicious because in some sense they've been burnt by some kind of borderline, because a borderline has ripped out reality from under their feet, so much so that they don't have confidence in incepting themselves into a stable metagram circuitry. Anyway, but what narcissists also do then is they kind of have this other power. They have the power to divert other people from their metagram circuitry and to collectivize into some kind of community where they are dominated by the narcissist's melodrama or metagram circuitry. So they have this kind of binding force, potentially, to plug into some kind of thematic associative power game that is, in some sense, I shouldn't call it a power game, but it's certainly premised within some kind of psychological subversion and manipulation. And it's a very basic game that many people with properly developed metagram circuitry are, sort of have even natural awarenesses and inclinations as to, sort of living in the little bottled terrarium. But it's interesting that, let's say, social organizations or groups that are organized around certain things, it's perhaps an adaptive advantage to have a narcissist creating some kind of propaganda or requisite incentive and de-incentive to sort of police the boundaries of the membrane of such an organization. That they perhaps form part of the glue, or sort of or in sort of acting as something of a guard at the border post. Anyway. That's perhaps not such a neat point to make, but it's worthy of note that essentially also that narcissists have perhaps the ability to erode other people's metagram circuitry and substitute it for their community circuitry, with that kind of with the melodrama. So in some sense, narcissists have the ability to corral people, to bind them together and corral them, to sort of stymie other people's metagram circuitry. And perhaps there is metagram circuitry out there which is, for lack of a bet, look, I don't want to go too much into this, but let's just say that other people might have some forms of disparate or toxic, or let's just say antisocial metagram circuitry, that the borderline can sort of act as a kind of, as an antibody by by diverting it into its introjective paradigm. In some sense, what the narcissist in fact does is usually perhaps much better than what the borderline does to people. Because in some sense what the borderline does to people is the borderline actually creates a kind of anger and self-awareness in the metagram circuitry, because they are, through the borderline, seeing modeled to them complete reality tunnels that are disregarded and that are given no fidelity. So you kind of, I would say that you start to feel hollow being exposed to a borderline, because, you know, as soon as you're on one narcissistic track with the borderline, and then that narcissistic track is completely displaced, is shockingly supplemented by a completely ulterior reality position. You sort of you perhaps, you know, if you want to avoid that shock again, the only thing that you can do is just completely recede, is just completely detach, either from the significance of one's own thinking and actions and or ever, or from the that kind of toxic atmosphere which is being generated by the borderline, and whatever the borderline is capable of adapting into its deployment of these kinds of reality games, which, you know, in the case of identity politics and, you know, the cultural conventions that exist that have, you know, sort of these double standards, you know, and a kind of relativistic morality baked right into the basic premise of it, because these people, they don't have fancy rationale and sophistication. It works all on the level of premise, and the premises are so ugly and obtuse, and essentially based on playing some kind of hyperbolic moral panic, and broadcasting a hyperbolic moral panic so that no one can even go over the premises and, you know, reason from first principles. So it's a complete sort of abrogation of intelligence and replacing it with a project of control, and a kind of a gambit for an escalating unilateral absorption of all morality and authority. As it's, you know, simultaneously playing these word games and semantic substitutions, to further insulate its sort of its ability to set up these unilateral reality tunnels, which at the end of the day must demand blood, some kind of blood sacrifice from the scapegoated identity, because otherwise it won't be able to justify its own sort of contradictions. It needs to divert pressure from its own incoherent project of sort of creating a counterfactual ideal out of the energy of the enemy perpetrator scapegoat identity, that should have already been better and been different, so as to already deliver the thing that is being demanded as missing, or as being labeled as being deserved and unbestowed. And so, sort of it translates the sequence of life into just defining things as being unbestowed and deserved. And then all their semantic claims support that, and all their sociological planning has that as its purported goal, but it never arrives at those things, because it's a form of interpretation from a reactive mentality. It's built out of the counterfactual gainsaying of that, oh yes, the scapegoated identity should have already facilitated this, should have already provided this to me, or to my identity, and it goes unbestowed, and the unbestowed accolade is an injustice. And so you have a whole morality that is based on, I mean, I've said this before, it's based on converting envy into jealousy, because something that you're envious of is something that is at least some kind of moral failing. But if you can be jealous of it instead, then you can say that it was taken from me already in some paradigm, in some form of analysis. And so they've got an ideology that tells them that everything that they're envious of is stolen, and that they can jealously demand from the structure of the system. And so they've got a kind of infinite regress in being able to just, as long as they can generate envy, they can redress it up and claim that it's a rightful jealousy, that they can be malevolent and sadistic around not achieving. And so that is such a psychologically taxing, that is such an ideologically convoluted process of conversion of envy into jealousy, that they can't even look at what they're doing to reality. They can't even look what they're doing to morality. They can't look at anything else, because they can't look at reality and pragmatism and how the world works in any way other than the stupid moral dimension of social psychology is the only paradigm that, to someone with a hammer, everything looks like a nail, sort of thing. So they are stuck with their non-solution. And in some sense, what borderlines end up doing, in their personal sphere, is they end up sort of ruling out of they end up getting the control that they seek out of a kind of stabilized fear. And in some sense, it's a horrible thing to be associated with, because the idea is that people are gambling if they can imagine that the borderline can just be less disruptive and less malevolent. So it's kind of like, well, I guess that's almost exactly what narcissists do as well, in order to train people to sort of bend the knee. But in some sense, the narcissist, I think, requires you to depend on them to be a stable source of reality, so that you don't have to keep on defending your position against an unfair set of claims. But at least the narcissist is capable of keeping the story straight, perhaps, to some degree. I mean, it does confabulate, but you're capable of outwitting the narcissist and binding them by their own word. You're not capable of doing that with a borderline. because a borderline does not have to sort of have any sustained projection of integrity in their identity, which is much like identity politics, where the weakness of the identity is the proof and sort of the derivation of the necessity of the project and the moral panic and the imperative that their sociological planning gets adopted by everyone and supported by everyone and advanced by everyone. Anyway, I'm talking too much about this stuff, but so it is interesting that narcissism is kind of like a maybe a little bit of an antidote to the borderline. But that it's also perhaps a general antidote to metagram circuitry in other people that would otherwise perhaps be potentially I mean, I guess you can kind of see the existence of narcissism within societies. I mean, this is the problem with what I'm talking about, because I'm almost trying to make sort of sociological observations about these psychological properties, that what perhaps they are useful for doing. But yeah, I think you could see sort of narcissists as sort of being tax collectors. And they are taxing people for not adhering to a common core, to a cohesive, coherent set of conventions that at least put some guardrails around the kind of narcissistic supply, because in some sense that is the only limit that a narcissist is curtailed by. And in some sense I think that, this has perhaps been the value of, let's say, the British development of liberal democracy and liberal politics. That the kind of British liberalism has been the most successful arc of cultural development that, in some sense, responsibly sets up protections of the culture against, these kinds of malevolent psychopathological things, not by directly creating an alternative imperialism to them, but sort of doing it in an interesting, principled way, which has not been a complete envelope and segregation and firewall between these psychopathologies and the culture, but so it's kind of been an uneasy sort of, not exactly a Cold War within the liberal container. Because I would say that as long as you have some kind of imperial culture, or that has arbitrary conventions that just have to sort of be adhered to, narcissists and borderlines can both, I think, use those as useful scaffolding to install their spider webs and such, and their hooks and their lures. Power that doesn't have to be reasoned or substantiated. Anyway, let me stop this recording, but yeah, so I don't know if that was even useful for me to bring up at all. I don't think I made that last point that I was trying to make on narcissism very clear, so I'm just going to quickly clean that up. So I'm trying to sort of state that narcissism has this power of taxing aberrance within group structures, because narcissists at some point have to embed themselves in sort of at least the superficial structure of group values, or some kind of collective edifice or premise that has to be woven into their grid of some kind of community or collective psychological system. Yeah. And so, yeah, I think my analogy of narcissists as being sort of antibodies to group structures is I mean, usually I think they're narcissists can also be described as sort of viruses in their own right, and sort of parasitic, or sort of like at least some kind of predator that predates under the cover of performing some kind of function, or at least for having some kind of value. Because if they don't, let's say, model or exemplify some kind of value, they don't have an ability to keep the people or the energy that they're trying to trap within their structure. And that value could also be merely the value of safety that they are providing the threat to. So you know, it can also just be implicitly in the drama that they are particularly what's the word, that they are instilling, or sort of you know, it's in the style of the agitation. Perhaps there's a value there's a value that is being taken hostage, or something like that, or being used as the way to sort of coerce, or to plan other people's subscription to an ongoing sort of dance, or something like that. Anyway, and I mean, I would think that usually what a narcissist would do is they would try to position themselves into a position of authority where they can essentially safely deploy their methods of you know, sort of compulsion into compliance with their you know, where there is some dimension of tolerance which can be developed and inculcated in their environmental participants in this collective metagram circuitry. Anyway, so anyway, I think I said the point that I wanted to make here. But essentially what the narcissists, I think, would especially do is they would be like a kind of a local tax collector, and they would be specifically taxing to people that were strong and independent, that had the ability to resist the general flow of, let's just say, the matrix. So they would be almost like a police force against people that perhaps were capable of jailbreaking themselves, or jailbreaking other people, or having any kind of sophisticated insight that sees through the narcissistic ploys. And so, anyway, there is, and I mean, some people might do those things, might be aberrant in the metagram circuitry in a way that is actually another form of psychopathology, which narcissists might also be able to tune down the negative influence thereof. So sort of, you know, the tax is, this form of tax collection is slowing down the activities of both, let's say, the enlightened aberrant and the, let's say, chaotic dissident alike. And anyway, most organizations, perhaps, or cultural structures, you could say, might get some benefit out of having even superficial police protection, to use the metaphor that the narcissist has a kind of antibody function in some dimension. Because it also, what narcissists will also do is they will take ostensible values in a structure and they will eventually pathologize them for the purposes of control, which will, I believe, become a trope, some kind of social construct at some point, and then that social construct can be nuanced and refined, perhaps in an institution like a legal system or a legal tradition that has the right kind of jurisprudence would be able to actually, so this is why I make such a big criticism against what I call, the kind of the continental European legal system, the Napoleonic legal structure. I think is wholly culturally corrupt. It's, it really defends narcissism, whereas if you have, let's say, a strong liberal constitution that is really premised in very good first principles, which sadly the American Constitution, I think, is, although it's very intelligently devised, it doesn't have the principles available to its citizenry to be justiciable and defendable in court, sadly. But if you have at least the common law and some kind of legal sort of discovery of the common law that is evolved through principles, then there are at least some legal avenues and facilities to essentially be a bulwark against having values being converted into simply just implements of control, essentially. But yeah, so I mean, I made a claim at the beginning that, I was going to sort of talk about the 1950s and how that's relating to sort of, issues around sort of like the fourth turning, and, like how you have different arcs and epochs within sort of culture and history. Anyway, so I mean, I see this on a much more sort of nuanced psychological kind of arc, but it is interesting that perhaps the macro cycle does seem to involve borderline personality disorder. I mean, I do think that this is exactly what was, this has all culturally happened before. Identity politics is nothing different from Nazi philosophy and Nazi culture. And in some sense, the narcissism sort of just raises the ante in exacerbating some kind of switch that if you can't keep narcissism in check, then you end up with a system that sort of needs to sort of have its fidelity and integrity sort of renewed, or sort of apportioned and re-evaluated. And in some sense, borderline is almost like the agent or the catalyst of providing that necessity, because they're going to sort of hold the system hostage to its own sort of relativism and unstable whatever, and until the system is capable of speaking some coherent alternative or structure. That's capable of withstanding the kind of the diversion and the inception, that has a stable enough edifice that it's not going to incline itself towards sort of the vectors of demoralization and subversion, and the lures and the hooks which culture has essentially through bad caretaking has sort of allowed itself to be installed with, and so you have, I mean, I know of many academics, I shouldn't say many, I think I've spoken to two philosophy academics who were actually both women as well, and they even say that, they basically told me blankly in private. This is perhaps, this is a scandalous kind of revelation that, they think that identity politics is stupid. But you sing for your supper. If you want tenure, if you want to do well in the department, you write papers about epistemic injustice. You sing along with the chorus, and they, quite frankly, don't have a moral bone that sort of keeps them up at night. It's just an academic exercise. That they are sort of there to sing the chorus of the mob mentality, and sort of that lack of fidelity, or that lack of integrity. It's in some sense, I mean, these people, they don't perhaps even regard themselves as being that profane, because they are supplying, instead of integrity, they are supplying sympathy. They are being sympathetically allies and supporters. Anyway, and that I think is sort of the basic corruption of the loss of first principles, essentially. It's interesting. Sorry, this is almost a comical aside, but I was watching a comedy. There's this sort of quite a nice sort of comedic streamer, and he sets up these elaborate sort of things that, the whole thing is sort of farcical and things like that. And he did this one thing where he sort of dressed up as the Pope, and people would call him and confess their sins, and then he would sort of either give them Hail Marys to do, or tell them that they're going to hell, and based on their confessions. And this one person, I mean, I guess this is a bit of a joke, and he said, okay, he said, I'm sorry, but there's no hope for you, son. You're going to hell. And he said, oh, it's okay. I'm a furry. Like, I already knew that I was going to hell. And it's interesting that. Anyway, I wanted to juxtapose that with the removal of integrity and the replacement of, I mean, obviously that's a joke, but the removal of integrity and the replacement of integrity with sympathy. Integrity on the level of the intellect, of what is reasonable, and replacing it with sympathy. That there, within the joke around furries being, sort of beyond redemption, or sort of, that there is something, anyway, there's something quite basic around the supplementation of integrity and reasonableness with sympathy. Anyway, I mean, I haven't thought too much about furries, but I do wonder if that isn't sort of, I still think that kind of perversion is, I think, related to this cultural permissiveness of indulging in a relativism which gets to have its own sort of relativistic morality that it can sort of unilaterally dictate. And I would suggest that furries are just another sort of variant that are hanging onto the coattails of the feminist project, which is sort of to normalize the relativism that is in all the different variants of identity politics. That I do think that the sort of the furry camp, as it were, or the furry propensity, although I mean it's a pornographic sort of thing. It's basically people who have been sexually programmed, in the valence of sort of bestiality, and they hopefully they don't do that, but they explore it conceptually or something like that, and maybe it has transhuman sort of ideas, that eventually we want people to look like animals, or something like that, or at least that is the fantasy perhaps, but not wishing to over, as I've said, I mean, this is just kind of wild speculation, but in the same way that I've described the whole sort of transsexual conflation, um, of the kind of combining the genders, or combining the sexes, um, that the allowance, or at least the removal of transgressive boundaries into a kind of into a unified um, sexual ideal. Anyway, these are things that are they're worth talking about, and they do have thematic connections, but I'd have to set this up more carefully. But anyway, I'll just say that in some sense I think that this is this is one of the components of the kind of moral um, fragmentation which creates the kind of permissive cultural context for sort of greater demoralization. And in some sense, I do think that the people that have caught this bug um, are the same type of people that, perhaps when they are even quite young, saw this theme of having their sexual energy and having their sexual interests being gated by ideological structures. And so, within a culture in which sexuality is regulated by ideology and sort of conceptual structures of, getting permission for your identity or something like that, you have already sort of abstracted sexuality. Where some targets of sexual interest are safe and some are not safe from the ideology's point of view, where essentially transgression as well is celebrated, transgression of some model of what is progressive and what is not progressive, and in some sense also the need to rely on some kind of grievance in order to excuse yourself to have sexual interest or sexual proclivity or sexual energy. So you've created this whole maniacal mechanism to, it's almost like a new form of I'm trying to make this analogy here, that in days gone past, what's the point that I'm trying to make? I'm just trying to say that, like, when now I've lost my point, but it's something like you had to, yeah, I mean, the analogy doesn't work that well, but essentially it was not hard, but it was harder to follow the rules and etiquette and do the proper thing around sexual mores. Now there are similar restrictions, but there are kind of, but in some sense, you know, the things that are off limits are, inverted commas, heteronormative. That's what you should be ashamed about, is your heteronormativity, or something like that. Because it's structurally oppressive to women, it's structurally oppressive to groups that are structurally disenfranchised, you know, so and in some sense, the only forms of sexuality which are safe are ones that are premised on some kind of sympathy binary between, you know, sympathy providers and sympathy extractors. And so you have a very degraded sexual dynamic, which is essentially devoid of admiration, is devoid of respect and honor. It's purely sort of transactional under the auspices of the ideological structure. Or in the grooves of the ideological system. And anyway, I just wanted to make the point that I did think that furries basically have taken the blue pill, but it's perhaps not so politically prominent in that community. Or, I mean, I don't really know what the community is like, but I do get a sense that even people in the furry community, they have this disjuncture where they know that their fetish is essentially, is problematic, essentially, is morally incoherent or something like that. But I do think that in some sense it is the cultivation or the inclination of a transgressive, you know, in some sense I think it's only pursued because it is transgressive, and that essentially the nature of that transgression has been already broadcast and normalized by the kind of feminist activism. I mean, I think men who obviously grow up as boys, generally speaking, are very sensitive to some of these cultural, ideological moves that are happening within the culture, which is, you know, why sort of gender dysphoria. You know, I mean, most like real transgender cases are always essentially boys that want to be girls or men that want to be women. That's what I mean. The reverse is an ideological thing. That is not transgenderism. It's something else that's manifesting as that sort of symptom. But anyway, I've just invalidated so many people's lived experiences, I guess, there. But I think that is because the boys that have this kind of transgender problem are manifesting that issue you know, and because there are issues that look similar to this, which I think are psychologically nothing like this. You know, for example, transvestites, you know, is not gender dysphoria. interestingly enough. But yeah, the anyway, why am I talking about this? I guess it's just to round off a point about the sympathy stuff. I believe that what transgenderism actually is, which is all about boys wanting to be girls, is because essentially is similar to the themes that I've just been bringing up about the fairies and stuff like that. Is that it is about sympathy extraction and sympathy providers, and I think that essentially I don't know how to put this. I mean, this is going to be like a vague, nebulous description, but in as much as that you can generally see, I, within the MBTI matrix of personality, you get alpha, beta, gamma, delta. I would just remark that all the transgender cases are, generally speaking, delta personalities. Maybe sort of a combination of delta and gamma. And that's just for me to make a stereotype there, or an archetype. And I think that what you're actually seeing is individuals that have a certain model of sexuality, which is a sympathy extractor and sympathy provider, and they're on the wrong side of the divide. And those stereotypes are gendered within the convention of culture. And so if they want to engage in the sexual position of sexual energy that they are interested in, they have to go to the other side of the fence. That's what I think it is. But in some sense, the problem is, or I would say, is that sexuality has been encoded as being sympathy extractor and sympathy provider. But that is something that they have modeled off of a woman at a very young age, that they have witnessed that sexual game, or they have witnessed that sexual dynamic being orchestrated by a woman successfully, or essentially seeing the latent surrender that men provide to women. And they have, because delta personalities seem, when a delta personality opens up, you see very critical thinking, you see very elaborate thought processes that are usually sort of obscure to some degree, which is the reason why they're not often very forthright in their opinions and their beliefs and their thoughts and their thinking. They don't sort of share them directly. But if they could expect sympathy, then they can share more freely. It unlocks it gives them a groove through which to communicate fluidly, or at least anyway. So I do think that there is a I think it's interesting because also delta personalities, I would say, are also capable of sort of sustaining injuries. Sort of the quiet person, and then you sort of the still waters run deep, and that there are troubles brewing at certain levels of depth within this personality, and that it just sort of reinforces the sort of the desperate search for some kind of vent, or some kind of mechanism of resolution, which often then has quite a stark sexual, I mean, they could have other avenues, but generally I think deltas are the ones who are who have very stark what's the word? Differences between, you know, some section of their life, and it's very compartmentalized, or something like that. But anyway, it's not that important to clean up that. But yeah, it's some kind of division like that, some kind of escapism or something like that. And I think that the kind of escapism that deltas usually end up indulging in is usually something to do with sexuality. But and so I think that, you know, the gender dysphoria is a certain manifestation of that compartmentalization, or at least finding a vent for that. Because I do think there are other deltas who just, for example, have very, let's just say, very radically indulgent sexual fetishes that perform this function just the same. So, you know, sort of you get a spectrum. You get people that want to have it compartmentalized, and there are other people that want that part of their life to sort of be injected evenly across all of their manifestations of themselves. So there's some people who essentially want to be in that sexual vibe. They only need it to release or something like that, or they want it all the time. You know, so there's sort of different, and so I think that the sort of the transgenderism thing is generally toying with the idea that you can sort of be in a sexual valence and be constantly venting what would otherwise be pent up, you know, and there is some kind of aspect of hypersexuality, I would argue. I don't want to give, when I'm talking off the cuff like this, it's perhaps a little bit too sloppy to just sort of put labels onto people, but there is something about a persistent indulgence when transgenderism is essentially is the idealized, iconized, you know, sort of preferred mode. And I mean, look, I mean, these are also things that it's not as if people just want to do this suddenly. You know, usually it's a burgeoning process of sort of self-inquiry and thinking about it, and blah blah blah, that it doesn't happen overnight. I want to be a woman suddenly. That doesn't just happen. It's I think I want to be a woman, you know, like, how does this work? You know, because I mean, it is fundamentally problematic, because, you know, you have to actually believe that you're transitioning, otherwise it's not worth doing. And if you don't believe, you know, so it's wrought with problems, because, you know, if you're not transitioning, then it's not worth doing. And so you have to actually believe that, for example, that there are genders, that there are two genders, because otherwise there's nothing that you're arriving at. Anyway, and in some sense, as I say, I think that these things are more connected with the concept of sympathy extractor and sympathy provider, and wanting to be on the other side of the fence, of not having to provide sympathy but being able to extract it. And so it's more about a cultural interface being able to use a convention in order to inhabit the mentality that you prefer, essentially. So anyway, so you could perhaps argue if there was a better mediation within culture between those roles, if perhaps things like transgenderism wouldn't dissolve, and obviously things have exploded because of the toxic identity politics, which in some sense tries to say that, well, everyone's identity should be a sympathy extractor, as canonized by the system that needs to be purified by this project. You know, you've got this exacerbation, but also ideological forms of this. And in some sense, the whole, you know, I would even suggest that maybe there are less cases of transgenderism, of authentic transgenderism, and there are more of this other ideological variety, which is in some sense the sympathy extractor is more about disrupting the identity, the scapegoated identity. So it's more about being malevolent and extracting a kind of narcissistic supply. So it becomes more about sort of the redistribution of harm than it does about sympathy actually being exchanged. And so there's just a general sympathy for tolerating people extracting and redistributing harm and damage. And so it becomes much more viscerally tribal and nasty and dirty and gritty, you know, in terms of its sort of guerrilla politics. And in some sense, I mean, so I mean, I guess to that extent also it might. So perhaps this wouldn't really have a real effect on the authentic transgender cases, but it does just actually muddy the waters for the authentic transgender cases, because they actually want something to transition to, whereas the whole identity politics thing is sort of is a completely ulterior system that is just trying to sort of collapse the whole system and be as disruptive as possible. Anyway, I think I'll stop doing this, but yeah, I think that's the last point that I wanted to make.